We have Clayton Howard from HCJB, who produces the DX Party Line. Next is George Wood with the Radio Sweden t-shirt on. Tony King of Radio New Zealand. David Monson of the Belgian radio. David's boss, Lena Coquette. Watch what you say, David. Watch what you say. Alfonso Montealegre from Radio Nederland. That strange Canadian, Ian McFarland of RCI. And Bob Zanatti of Swiss Radio International. What we're going to do is take questions, and Robert here will take your questions, and then they will answer them. If you want to direct it to one person in particular, fine. If you want to direct it to everybody, all those who want to answer can answer in some sort of fashion. If it's a general question, we can go down the line or something. And so, Robert.
Like I said, raise your hand if you want to ask a question to somebody up here.
My name is George Papa, and I'd like to address this question to the panel, please. When and how can the international broadcaster and the manufacturer of shortwave radio equipment put their heads together to increase shortwave radio listenership?
The question is not completely clear.
Well, maybe I can start it off.
Yes, please do.
Because I think Swiss Radio International and Radio Canada International, along with Radio Nederland and Radio Sweden, have got together in our little group of four.
The Gang of Four.
The Gang of Four, as I have renamed it. And we have come to grips with the problem in one way. We've got together with Panasonic. And please, nobody misprint this in your club bulletins and everything. It's Panasonic, not Sony. Panasonic. We've got together and we've produced, it was Radio Canada International's idea, I must make that perfectly clear. And we broached the subject to the other three members of the Gang of Four, and they liked the idea, so we went ahead with it. We have put into every Panasonic receiver that has shortwave bands on it a little four-part accordion card, we'll call it. It's really 4 postcards. And each of the 4, there's one for Radio Sweden, one for Radio Nederland, et cetera, with our address on it. You just have to tick off which language you listen to, and you mail it to the appropriate radio station, and you get a program schedule and various and sundry other bits of information. So this is one way that we can project the fact that there are at least 4 radio stations on shortwave that people can listen to. And we haven't had thousands and thousands of the cards back, but there have been a few hundred of them come back. The project is only really in its infancy. They've only started putting them into the receivers in the last 6 or 8 months. So it's going to take a while before we really get some idea of the response to it. But that's one way we have of pushing the fact that there are things to listen to out there on the shortwave bands, because I think most radios these days that have shortwave bands on them are bought mainly for the fact that they've got AM and FM on them, and maybe a public service band or something if it's an American buyer. And perhaps this way we can promote the shortwave aspect of what's on that radio. And the response we've had, I think we've had something like, up till April, we had 150 or something from the U.S., something like that. And of course, the other areas quite a bit less. I don't know whether Bob knows what sort of response they've had, but or any of the others, but...
I didn't know anything about this. I'm glad you took the question.
They've obviously been keeping him in the dark.
Could I ask you, were you referring in your question to the old story of who's responsible for propagating or promoting shortwave listening? Is it the stations or the receiver manufacturers? Is that what you had in mind?
Not particularly, Bob. The general idea, there's so many beautiful programs being directed to North America, where I'm from San Francisco, by all of you. And yet the listenership is so limited. And por qué? Warum? Why? It seems to me that if the two of you got together, just sold the idea of shortwave per se, not any particular program,
You're
maybe
quite
get some
right, actually.
results.
Yes, we're not doing enough, and you're not doing enough either. Frankly, I don't mean to be rude, but I think your question was, what are the receiver manufacturers doing? Sorry, this is about the time I've been going to bed in America. I was mentally going to sleep, quite honestly. I'm on the European time still. I find myself waking up at midnight at 1 o'clock in the morning and raring to go. I'm not getting back into bed, having a wink of sleep. I think the receiver manufacturers are doing it themselves, quite honestly. Look at the equipment we've got on the market. Look at the equipment we've got on the market today. The most sophisticated technological equipment available. The only thing I think that really matters is the price. The moment that price goes down, and it's going to go down too, I'm sure it is. Look at this new Sony digital receiver. I mean, shortwave broadcasting, shortwave receiving rather, or listening to shortwave radio and programs from wherever they might come, has never been easier, frankly, and has never been more accessible to a shortwave listening audience. And I think the moment the listeners per se and by and large can afford to buy some of the sophisticated equipment, and it is, I think the price is coming down all the time. Well, Bob's your uncle, we've got no problem, we're in business.
On the other
Is that
hand,
the question? Is that what you were saying? Sorry, Bob. You want to argue with me?
No, you're dealing here with very much a chicken and an egg situation. It's the same thing with television. When television got started, was it the job of the television set manufacturers to encourage people to watch television, or was it the responsibility of the television broadcasters to supply sufficient propaganda and, if you like, programs as well, to encourage people to buy sets? It's the same story. Color television, all these developments. The fact is that no shortwave broadcaster, not even the Voice of America and the BBC, even the big ones combined, are in a financial situation to conduct worldwide campaigns to encourage people. I mean, campaigns of the type that you're accustomed to here that are really effective and cost a hell of a lot of money. Nobody's in a position to do that. So you have to try to help out and to propagate this hobby, if you like, or listening to shortwave wherever you can. The manufacturers are coming out with a lot of receivers. A couple of years ago, I read articles, 10 years ago, there was a lull in receiver manufacturing. People were wondering what was happening to shortwave. Color crafters went out of business. You didn't hear anything of them. The good old names, they were all going. And people said there are no receivers on the market. Shortwave is dead. And all of a sudden, the Japanese came in, and the American manufacturers came in again. They help us. We try to do what we can. But the problem is one of money. How can you possibly reach even a small audience or a small potential audience in the United States without the sums of money that we simply don't have? So my feeling is that it's the responsibility of the really confirmed believers in shortwave, that is you, the people who have come all the way to come here and listen to us, to get the word out. HCJB is represented here. They're selling a different product. But in effect, the principle is the same. They're proselytizing, and they want the word to go on. We're proselytizing too, and we want the word to go on, but we can only go so far. And the listener, who is really enthusiastic, has to spread that enthusiasm to somebody else. Tell a friend.
Yeah.
Bob, may I pose one more question in regard to this? The reason I'm asking, I'm conducting a personal study in the San Francisco area with the various consulate generals, etc., and with the newspapers, the local papers, radio stations, so forth. I have had occasion to call two consulate generals' office to ask if they've got a program for particular radio programs that are being directed to their office. They didn't know what the hell I was talking about.
You're absolutely right. Now,
You see? And I do not want to mention the particular offices. There's more than two.
Not the Swiss.
one of them was the Belgian Consul General. That's okay.
So, and how are we going to sell the idea to the public try to get the idea across to the newspaper if the guy is going to call up the consul general of X nation and he hasn't got even the program to
I agree with you.
schedule.
Did you check the Swiss?
Sir?
Did you check the Swiss?
Well, I'm not
The
saying
Swiss
any
consulate?
particular one.
No.
No, you're in good shape.
That's all I wanted to hear.
Well, I think one of the ones you might have called was the Canadian office, because we're running up against that same problem. Is that, I mean, we get letters from people that have gone over to Africa as CUSO volunteers. That's Canadian University Service Overseas. They go and work in Africa at the request of an African nation. And they don't even know that RCI exists until they get over there and start tuning around on this cheap little transistor shortwave radio that they brought with them, or they hear it on a friend's, and they come across our signal and they say, oh boy, here I am, I'm going to be able to get some news from Canada. They didn't know about it until they got over there. But all of this publicizing it takes time. We have a publicity department that consists of 5 people, plus me on a very temporary basis whenever I get my thumb in that particular pie in RCI. To put a quarter-page ad in something like the New York Times, I could do 4 years of DX Digests just for what it would cost for that, or even in the Denver Post. So publicizing it has got to be done on a fairly local basis, and I think that's where the clubs come in strongly. They can do articles in their local papers.
I mean, if you
For
want
nothing.
to equate it to communism, you're the cells. You know, you're the local cells. And politically, that's the way it works. I mean, even in democracies, the local workers, the political workers, they knock on the doors, they go around and work night and day and proselytize. And that's exactly the kind of support we need. Our funds are limited, our abilities are limited.
I suggest that each of you go back and make sure that the broadcaster tells your State Departments or your Foreign Office to have their programs available to the general public, because in some cases they don't know what you're talking about. When you call
Well,
the program,
we for one are working on that at the moment. We've had 2 or 3 little touring groups from the External Affairs Department in Ottawa, and they had their eyes open. They didn't really knew that they had no idea what we were doing, what we were all about.
Let me tell you something very frankly. Selling shortwave radio in Africa is a very simple thing. All you need there is money to buy the receiver.
To buy the receivers.
In developing countries, everybody knows what shortwave is. It's their only source of information. The big nut for us to crack, ironically, is this big, wealthy North American market. And that's because the people have got everything they need and more than they need, and they want everything simple and push button, no problems, hands off, turnkey, as silly and as idiotically simple as possible. And shortwave is not yet at that point where everybody can go along with his microwave oven and right next to it push a button and hear SRI coming out of burn. Now, if we could come through next to the microwave oven in the kitchen at 7 o'clock in the morning as reliably as KRUD radio, we'd have no problem.
Get the word in edgewise here.
That is the problem, and people have gotten, frankly, there's no point in saying anything unless you're frank about it, so fat, dumb, and lazy that they're not interested in going to the trouble of figuring out or wanting to find out how to even use a shortwave radio. Now, how do you get to those people? There's no way that I in Bern or Ian in Montreal or Clayton Howard in Quito, Ecuador can get on the phone and say, hey, local station, we want to tell you about shortwave, because that's a passive audience. It's gotten to the point now that information talk shows on radio or television has come to the point, if you're talking about media now, in the United States of America and to a certain extent in Canada, is nothing more than background noise. You've got to have it to survive. I heard a disturbing study where something like 55% of American college and university students couldn't even study their homework at night without music or noise in the background. That's a study.
Tony Housewives do
Now,
ironing and soap operas.
if you get to that point now, to listen to shortwave, okay, you get on a local talk show, and you go all night, or you go all day and all night, or all week, or all month. How many of the people are actually going to pick up any valuable information from that from that program, and enough motivation to go out and buy a shortwave radio and knock on the door of the local club and say, teach me how to use it. I'm enthralled. I want to hear the news from the world. That's the problem. You get a passive audience, but it doesn't do you any good in the end because the people are not motivated to actually listen to the programs, to actually use the receiver. At best, they might buy one, put it up on the cabinet and say, my son got that, it's his hobby, I don't know anything about it. And the son doesn't know anything about it either. But you got a shortwave radio. And what can you pick up? Radio Moscow and the VOA. That's the problem. And that's where the local clubs have to come in and follow up. It isn't enough to attract people, even interest people in shortwave. You've got to follow it up, show them how to use it, and with a little expertise that all of you've got that's a precious commodity. You know what you're doing on shortwave radio. These people don't. You don't have to teach anybody to tune on a television. But you've got to teach people to tune in a shortwave radio, even with that 2001. That thing is more scary to some people than the thing with the knobs. So that's where the clubs come in. And I'm afraid the ball rests in your court and the buck stops there. Right there.
Okay, wait a minute, folks.
Your statement that it's that easy for us to go out and do programs that we're going to get on your local talk shows. Because like if we were going to do it, it'd be done by our transcription section. And our budget right now is below minimal. Our transcription section is dropping programs. We're not adding programs. And there's like no way that we can afford to pay somebody to start doing programs to put on, to send to North America, new programs besides the very few that we're still running. So like clubs, which are built on volunteer labor, you've got the wherewithal to do that kind of thing, but at least our station, and I think most of the other stations are going through budget hassles.
All right, if you're going to ask a question, like I said, raise your hand. Let me get to you with the microphone because we're taping this off the microphone upstairs for use possibly by Jeff White or by some of the other broadcasters. So please, let me get to you so the question can be taped, okay? Now, you want to keep this thing going, okay?
I'd like to direct a question to the European broadcasters, particularly apropos of the comment from Swiss Radio about the North American audience. Speaking as a West Coast person, reception from Europe is very much affected by the polar flutter. It comes over the North Magnetic Pole. The only way to avoid that is single sideband, basically, to get a good, clean signal. Now, do any of you see any future for SSB? I mean, the few times I've heard SSB from Radio Sweden and a little bit from Swiss Radio, it gives a good signal which people could understand. But you ask the average person to listen to a European broadcast on the west coast of North America, they get turned off very quickly by the flutter and the poor reception. I'm speaking of the non-DX or the non-member of our club. But the people you say that we want to persuade, the quality of the signal isn't that good.
I don't want to monopolize the microphone. I have a tendency of doing that. And I apologize to my colleagues, but since you mentioned single sideband, I feel the calling. Last year in Minneapolis, at this same time, I was asked about the single sideband experiments run by Swiss Radio International. And I appealed at that time for more feedback to the station. We got nothing, and the experiment was completely abandoned. It was written off by the Swiss Post Telephone and Telegraph Administration as a complete failure. And I have to agree with them. There was no feedback. We had also had a bad choice of frequencies. Nothing to do with us, because we're not responsible for frequency selection or the operation of transmitters. As far as, speaking more philosophically, single sideband is coming, there's no doubt. I mean, we've been saying this on SRI now for years. And you're absolutely right. It'll get through where nothing will get through. Sideband will cut through and give you a good signal. This was taken up at the World Administrative Radio Conference. There's been no decision taken on it. It's going to be taken up another time, and you're opening up a can of worms with an electric can opener. And they're going all over the place. What do you do about the third world? They can hardly afford a $25 transistor radio with one shortwave band on it. They're not about to go out in the bush. They're not going to be sitting there with the clarifiers tuning in sideband signals. The other thing is the amount of expertise. We were just talking about this before. The more complicated the rig gets, the more people you're going to turn off shortwave. It's as simple as that. Look, a couple of years ago, we're only going back 10 years, how many people even here tonight were still arguing about color television? It's not perfected yet. It's not ready yet. You wait 5 years, 10 years, and everybody's watching color television, but only because you got automatic circuits, automatic frequency control. You don't have to fiddle with anything. Sideband is the way of the future. The manufacturers are not ready. There's no standard. Are we going to have it A3J, meaning completely suppressed carrier, like hams use? Are we going to have reduced carrier? Are we going to have a pilot tone of some kind or a pilot signal? What system are you going to use? Same with color TV. I mean, it wasn't even that bad because the NARTB system was accepted, had been accepted for 20 years. But there are no systems for sideband. The problem of availability of receivers, expensive receivers, that's one thing. You're going to lose a lot of audience in the underdeveloped parts of the world. Even in the developed parts of the world, you don't have people who know how to tune them in. And as far as the flutter phenomenon is concerned, I think that to finish up on sideband, it's a question of time. I can't tell you when. You get any figure you want. Take potluck. 15 years, 20 years, knowing the ITU and the international organizations, more like 30, 40 years before that gets solved. I mean, WARC has just concluded last year. We're not even going to go into effect with these new frequencies for 8 or 9 years. There are two ways of getting around polar flutter. One is a very simple manipulation, and the other one is costly and political. For some reason, we haven't tried it, but we had some tips, and hams can tell you this too. We're beaming too high to get to the West Coast. We're beaming over the pole. That's the Great Circle route, which looks very good on paper. But as a matter of fact, what we should be doing is beaming farther south, avoiding the pole, losing field strength in the target area, but the trade-off is we're losing field strength but gaining in the quality of the signal because you don't have any flutter. The other solution is the simplest of all. You build a relay station. It costs money. You can do anything with money.
And it's the only thing we don't have.
And that's what we don't have. And in the case of Switzerland, it's politically unacceptable because you have to deal with another country. If you want to hear the voice of Switzerland, it's going to be from our own backyard or from nowhere. That's our particular problem. But there are ways out, and sideband is coming. But in the meantime, rely on the relay stations and maybe some technical manipulations and higher power. That's all you can do.
Okay. Well, you raised a point before concerning possibly getting on local radio stations, and I think that that's a really exciting concept, and it's something I've never thought of. Now, I've been DXing for about 10 years, and most of the time I've been doing it. When I've told people about the hobby, they think it's CB or they think I'm a ham, and that in itself, I think, is one of the problems that you're experiencing. A lot of people don't even know what shortwave is or what it's for. And just thinking for the last couple of minutes about what you possibly said about getting on radio stations, let's say if I myself contacted a talk show host on one of the local Chicago stations, would you be open to me working as a go-between to setting up some type of interview program where this talk show host could interview perhaps a couple of you on like I don't know, either via tape or perhaps even live, doing some type of conference calling type of thing? Would that be something that would be feasible?
Who pays for the call?
Well, I'm sure they would pay for the call.
Well, if in theory, if the station doing the program, they would normally pay for the phone, they'd call one of us.
Mm-hmm.
I, for one, working for an organization whose prime target area is North America, meaning the U.S., as well as Central America and South America. But the main target area for English and French in this area is the States. We've had people from our North American service. The head of that particular section has been down, I think, in Texas last year. They had a Canadian Radio Week or something, I think, down there, and he was on a talk show, and it proved very successful. So it's something we've tried, and I think we'd be more than happy to try it again.
I think most broadcasters would be happy to do something like that, but we need advance notification. You
Oh, yes.
can't. I mean, we're tight schedules, tight staffs. People are running all over the place. You can't just call up and say, "Hey, we're on the air. Do you mind saying a few words?" You'd have to know days in advance, preferably even a week or so. Something could be arranged because we're all interested in propaganda, or advertising, whatever you want to call it. But you need advance warning. Contact the station if possible. Tell them your plans. Would you like to take part? I know it's time-consuming, and it's not very typically North American, but it's very typically European. You need time, you need to consider it, get ready, arrange it, write in the people for the work schedule and everything. It's entirely feasible.
I mean, it's even possible in our case, just to rent a program line from RCI to whatever station the program is being done on, and just have it a two-way open line program. Quite simple.
I wanted to ask all the members up there, and especially Belgium and Radio New Zealand, you mentioned having relay stations. Would it be possible for the small stations, such as Belgium, New Zealand, to get with the big stations like the BBC and Radio Netherlands, and to beam their broadcasts on one of their relay stations and work in cooperation, so that the times that the big stations aren't using theirs, that you could broadcast a smaller station?
Good evening from the South Pacific. Radio New Zealand has, with 7.5 kilowatts, of course, is a pittance compared with our friends on the other end of the table. They have looked at getting together with our friends across the Tasman, using the transmitters at Lyndhurst. But of course, the answer you get from the Australian Post Office is that the transmitters are fully committed, which is understandable when you know the program schedules of Radio Australia. I've suggested that they get something out of mothballs in Hawaii that I think used to belong to the Voice of America and ship them down there, but probably the sea corrosion would kill them by the time they got there. We are holding ours together with 7.5 kilowatts, and our answer to the question, which I'll tell you about tomorrow, is $8.5 million, and then we'll have 250 kilowatts and we'll be being heard in most places.
I have something to add. I could ask you one question. You should ask that question to big stations. Would they allow small stations to transmit on their broadcasts, on their transmitters, broadcast on their transmitters? You see what I mean? I answered your question with another question.
Yes, but if I can just add to clarify that, the BBC and RCI work on a reciprocal basis. There is absolutely no money changes hands. We relay their North American service, they relay us in Europe. If there wasn't a two-way operation there, it would cost somebody some money. Nobody can afford to do it for free. We may love them like brothers, but if they want to use the transmitters, they have to pay for it because it costs us money to run the transmitters. And, we can barely afford to get along ourselves. I'm sure it's the same for Belgian radio. They couldn't afford to relay anybody else for free. So that's precisely why the BBC and us have this reciprocal agreement, because it doesn't cost either of us any money. It's just an exchange of transmitter time.
Actually,
Ian said it, it's a question of exchange. It's not enough to ask it, not even if we are willing to pay. It's because it's not only a question of money also. There could be a political aspect also. Because relay stations are often situated in the third world. Those relay stations are under contract between the station in Europe, let's say, for instance, and the government of the country where the relay station is built. So, the station in Europe cannot give time on the transmitters on to other stations.
Well said, Leonard. No. Actually, I don't know. I suppose I'm just simpleton in these matters, really. I really don't understand much about the technicalities. Quite honestly, I don't. I just see it in terms of bureaucracy, inertia, apathy, indifference, and sheer bloody-mindedness. Frankly, there is a lot more room for cooperation. That's absolutely true. There is a hell of a lot. I've heard... Sorry, can you hear me? Didn't you hear me? You didn't hear anything I said? I don't normally have this problem. Not with BRT's transmitters on our new North American frequency anyhow. 15,380. How's that for a commercial? I'm not even on duty tonight. No, fact is... No, what I was saying, I see, perhaps I'm a simpleton in these matters. I know I am. I really don't know much about the technicalities. Perhaps I should know more than I do, but that's your job after all. I'm just the idiot that sits there every night, and tries to get people to listen a bit. I've heard some of these same arguments come up year after year, and I've been around trying to attend as many of these sort of conventions as I can and meeting as many people as I can in the business. I see it in terms, quite simplistically, of bureaucracy, inertia, indifference, and sheer bloody-mindedness. I think there's a lot of room for more cooperation. There really is. And I don't think, and I've said this about the... Oh, excuse me, sorry. Frankly, I think this might be the problem. There is a lot more room for cooperation. You mentioned money. Yes, money is important. But I think what's so much more important, is that spirit of cooperation, is the willingness, the desire to go ahead and do something together, is the initiative. Because once the initiative's taken, it's amazing, with a bit of enthusiasm, a bit of spirit, and a bit of your own bloody-mindedness too, it's amazing what you can do. It really is. It's incredible. We can be heard as shortwave broadcasters. I'm convinced if our authorities, if our governments, etc., took more interest in what we did. We had a fine example. I was very inspired by your question, sir, which is why I got quite anxious and worked up and something else. Fred tore up tickets. I'm sorry, I won 4 plastic bags tonight with that direction. I think what we need, I've been amazed talking from personal experience, what you can do with so little, and I think your station, sir, Mr. Howard, Mr. Clayton, your station is an example. You're being heard. We are being heard with a decent frequency now, better possibly than we've ever been heard in the history of BRT broadcasting. We're not relaying through anybody, but we have a decent frequency of the States, and we at last seem to be getting through somehow. Because, why? Because we've had the cooperation from certain people who have taken a very keen and enthusiastic interest in what we're doing. People like Jim Conrad up there. You don't know this, Jim, but we've just appointed you chief of our technical staff at the BRT. I'll be informing the Director General when I get back in 2 weeks' time.
You'll have to pay for your own move, though.
If the distinguished colleague from Belgium will yield. Cooperation is a wonderful thing. On the other hand, if you're talking about NATO, that's one thing. If you're talking about cooperation among Western European broadcasters, that's something entirely different. NATO is a political decision among the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to take part militarily. Their broadcasting services can't be compared to that. All of our stations in Europe, I think, with the exception perhaps of Radio Nederland and the Deutsche Welle, who have relay stations, forgetting the BBC, they're in another league entirely. Deutsche Welle and Radio Nederland are the 2 largest in Europe. They can afford the relay stations. They also have the connections. I mean, there's no question about that. They have the political connections. and the determination, the political determination to get those relay stations built. Now, for the rest of us, why should we exchange time with other broadcasters? Again, the can of worms. First of all, we don't have enough transmitter capacity ourselves. And secondly, there is a very real political problem here. Now, I represent a neutral country. I think it's fair enough to say the leading neutral country in the world. It's a neutral country by charter and international agreement. It has been virtually neutral since the year 1291. Now, it's all right for us to go and knock on somebody's door of an apparently friendly nation and say, may we use your broadcast transmitter time or your transmitter broadcast time? They say, yes, fine. Then they go knocking on our door and say, may we use yours? What is the content of the program? It's, let's assume, far from being neutral. They have an axe to grind. Switzerland can't afford to do that politically. Anybody with a point of view that's outside the sphere of neutrality is grinding an axe, and we just can't broadcast it. So, from a very real political point of view, as well as an economic and logistic point of view, I don't see the possibility of this kind of seventh heaven type of relay or broadcast exchange or transmitter usage exchange that David is talking about. I think the idea is great. We all wish it could be realized, but I don't see it from a practical point of view.
Don't you think then, Bob, that we should possibly start knocking on doors, you know? I mean, don't you think there's more that we can do back there in the...
Oh, I had a brilliant idea. I go knocking on doors every once in a while. My great brilliant idea was to get a Swiss ship on the high seas and put a transmitter on it.
Gosh, I'll join that.
That would be all right. We could sail it along the coast here.
Sure.
I'm dead serious. It didn't find very much support at the PTT.
But David, like, for example, we've got 2 transmitters that we use. We've got a third that's a backup.
Congratulations.
We're using them 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Where can we put in anybody else? Besides, I don't know anybody else who'd want to have a transmitter in Sweden, but I mean, we don't have any room to put anybody else on.
Yeah. I see it, I don't know, perhaps a little too philosophically, but I'd like to think, and I don't know, I think we're far too damn compartmentalized. I think we are, and it was a very descriptive term I heard just a few weeks ago. Came from a pianist, actually. She said, you know, and she was wildly enthusiastic about a recent visit she'd made to the States. She said, you know, the trouble is we're constipated in Europe. I think we should be, in many ways, more ways than one, we should be talking about some sort of European setup. Don't you think so? We, after all said and done, yes, I'm disseminating every night as Bob is talking about Swiss, as you are, talking about Belgian, Swiss, Swedish or Dutch culture. I think we should be sort of emphasizing more the European aspect of our broadcasting exercise.
I want to say that we have a man here in the United States by the name of Glenn Hauser that publishes a publication called the RIB. And every month he publishes a column, or rather a section, which he says, where he lists programs he likes to listen to. My suggestion is those programs that he lists in there are from many, many stations all over the world. And they are all of interest to people here in the United States, and they're very well selected. I suggest that column be syndicated in local newspapers by the day. In other words, he lists those programs by the day of the week. Certain days and certain times during the day, those programs can be heard over shortwave. Now, if that was published as a daily feature in newspapers throughout the United States, it would unquestionably create a lot of interest. And people would start to ask questions. How can I learn to hear this? Where can I hear it? How can I hear it? And so on and so forth. And I think it's an exceptionally good idea to syndicate that thing. Now, most newspapers would be very happy to have anything like that to fill in, because all they're looking for is space to take up paper with all of their damned advertising.
Glenn, do you care to reply?
It doesn't always...
Do you have anything to say?
You mean a
say
kind
something
of shortwave TV guide, daily listening?
A column that appears in every newspaper, or in many newspapers. Maybe it's only 2 inches long. but it lists that day's programs that can be heard by shortwave.
Very good idea.
Newspapers don't always
Very
want to
good
do
idea.
that kind of thing. In our country, there was a strike for 3 weeks, and the entire national network was off the air. You couldn't hear any Swedish programs except one program through the day, but everything else was off the air. And the newspapers printed this nice column every day about medium wave, AM broadcast stations you could hear on the continent. And the Swedish DX Federation went to the newspapers and said, hey, we want to tell you about all the shortwave stations you can listen to. And they wouldn't print it. You know, so newspapers just don't roll over on their backs and say, oh, we love you. You know, it's, you know,
Can we let
maybe you
Glenn
think
Hauser
they
get a
got
word
lots of
in?
room, but they don't always think that way themselves.
But I could just say quickly, we have seen this. I got the clippings. You got CB columns. They're all over the place. You've got all kinds of specialty columns. You got columns for hunters and gun nuts and car nuts and everybody else. I mean, why not shortwave? I think it's an excellent idea.
Many of you may not know, but I do have a column running in the Denver Post about shortwave. It isn't just program listings, but about shortwave, and I do go into programs. And I feel that I'm very fortunate to have that. It's been running over 10 years now, but I haven't seen other newspapers lining up to get it. On the other hand, perhaps I haven't pushed it, so I could try that. But I think as a rule, it's hard enough to get any radio information in American newspapers, let alone shortwave, unless you buy the space, of course.
I should like to tell you something about Holland. We have started since a few months ago. In all TV guides in Holland, we are publicizing our transmissions, and we get a lot of new telephone calls and letters asking us for our work. The Dutch program in shortwave has become very popular now, and all newspapers are collaborating. And we have, in a holiday season now in the summer, we have a program called Call Collect. So the people on holiday resorts can call us and ask for things and to give messages to family and things like that. So it's working out very good in Holland, this contact, direct contact with the people.
I was just going to comment on what you just said. I think part of the problem in the United States compared to what you just said is the United States doesn't have a domestic shortwave service. I don't listen to any particular station for United States news. I don't listen to, the VOA has no North American service.
No, it's not a domestic shortwave service. It's the shortwave service in Dutch for Europe and the whole world. But this call collect is only for Europe, along the Mediterranean countries.
I think the gentleman touches on a very interesting point as one of the basic problems. Going back to the original question about publicizing shortwave radio, it's a very serious problem in this country and in Canada. We have the same thing as Radio Nederland. It's called Eurocall, where we work in cooperation with the Swiss Touring Club, and we give out free program schedules to Swiss tourists going abroad, especially during the summer. What this amounts to is that shortwave is certainly no unknown entity in Europe. There is hardly a portable radio, even the cheapest you can buy, that doesn't have at least the 49-meter band. The reason for that mainly is because of Radio Luxembourg. And they're in the 49-meter band. But everybody knows if you mention shortwave, les ondes Kurzwelle, Kurzwelle, I think it is in Swedish, if I'm not mistaken. Whatever the expression, everybody knows what you're talking about. They can go to your radio and show you. They listen to it all the time. And since the United States, as you say, doesn't have a domestic shortwave broadcasting service, you're up against a brick wall. I mean, how do you possibly try to introduce anybody, any layman, into what is for them an esoteric subject? It's like going up to somebody on the street and saying, I think that what you need is a serious course in quantum mechanics. Now, if you talk to a scientist, he'll say, that's interesting, I would like to improve my knowledge. You talk to the average person, you're nut. And there's your problem. Now, I leave it up to you to solve, and we've been through this before. But that's the contrast. Europe knows all about it. We got more shortwave radio than you know what to do with. And here, you're grateful if people like us come and talk to you because we're rare birds. And the EDXC wants to kick us out, this sort of thing, from their conferences because there are too many. That's a very interesting point. I wish I could give you a concrete answer.
Okay, any other questions now? Let me go to another part of the audience here. I'll get everybody, don't worry. I don't have enough to be
This question is directed to all of the panel, although I think it's probably most relevant to the gentleman from RCI and Radio New Zealand. Many DXers and shortwave listeners, and certainly myself, find the programs of home services of countries, whether that's heard direct or via relays on international shortwave transmitters, more interesting and less full of propaganda and rather hyped up news and so forth than the international programs designed to be heard abroad, in that people prefer the eavesdropping aspect. And certainly I know this applies when I like to listen to, say, relays of CBC over RCI's transmitters, whereas, quite frankly, I find some of RCI's general programs rather much of a muchness when they're compared with the programs that are put out by almost every other station, because really, when it comes down to it, what can you do different? Now, the question I want to ask is, don't you think really there's a much bigger future in relaying home service programs on shortwave? This would save money, and I think it would be more interesting, and in the long run it would give a better impression of what a country is like when you're listening to what the people at home are listening to, rather than something that's just manufactured for abroad. I think that's part of the success of the BBC World Service, that it's the BBC World Service is in many ways very similar to the BBC domestic services. In fact, the BBC World Service uses much of the same programs that have been originally put out on the BBC's domestic services, and the news all comes from basically the same news sources. They use the same correspondence, and they have the same training and so forth. And that is one reason, I think, another reason why the VOA is singularly so unsuccessful, in that it has such a bland approach that doesn't really reflect what's really going on in America, and I'm sure that most Americans don't find Voice of America at all interesting, whereas in Britain, where you can pick up the BBC World Service on medium wave at the moment quite well, many people in Britain like listening to the World Service because they feel that it gives a good impression of what's going on at home, and the same thing happens abroad. So how do you see the future going? Because I know that Radio New Zealand and RCI relay the home service. How about the others?
Do you want an answer to that statement?
You want to take it up?
I think the success with the North American audience from Radio New Zealand is simply because of the novelty of relaying the temperatures at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, so that you can compare how lucky you are or unlucky you are at home. You get the home service program simply because there is no shortwave programming independent of the national program on Radio New Zealand, apart from about an hour a week, of which I have 30 minutes.
Yeah, into the mic, please.
We've only got 7.5 kilowatts, remember. So you get the domestic services usually by default, as much as we are serving the Pacific specifically to keep our neighbours in the Pacific content with what's happening to their families at home or working in New Zealand and then sending all the money back to the islands. But I think the appeal is the novelty. Though I think from the letters that we get at Radio New Zealand, there is a tremendous fascination for that sort of programming, because it is totally contrary to the larger international broadcasters who have a political objective or some strong objective.
Anybody else?
Well, perhaps I could just add a few words about the question there. I think that there's really room for both, because if you really knew how much of the material from the domestic network is heard on RCI's shortwave broadcasts, you'd be amazed. Because we just simply don't have the money. I hate to keep harping on this money, but it's a fact of life that we all have to live with. And we don't have the money to send people across the country doing interviews. SRI is a bit luckier in that aspect. They do a fair amount of traveling to the four corners of the globe. We don't. We simply don't have the money for it.
Relaying the home service would just would be a tremendous boom, because it would save so much more money. So I think I'm very surprised that more stations don't do it, as they all claim to be so hard up. Why does every
Yeah, but
seems to
a
be
lot
every
of
station-
the domestic programming is aimed at a domestic audience who know the background to particular things. They know that Joe Smith is a particular minister in the Canadian government, but somebody in Africa is not going to know him from Adam. You have to
A lot
couch.
of Canadians, too.
A lot of Canadians don't.
You see, why should someone living, say, in Africa, who may have no connection with Canada or any other foreign country, why should he listen to RCI rather than BBC, VOA, Swiss Radio International, Finland, Spain, or wherever?
The main reason he listens is because he's interested in finding something out about Canada.
If you find something about Canada, I think he'd be much more interested in listening to your home service.
Not necessarily. I still think there is room for both. Just as the domestic service doesn't have two kinds of programs only, we tend to have as much variety as we can manage, and we do relay some of the home service. But I mean, there's no way we can match up with that. The budget for As It Happens in a week would serve us for 6 months. Just their long-distance phone bill would do me for 2 years on the DX Digest.
What you're suggesting is a very interesting idea. I've thought about it myself on a number of occasions. I think in some certain circumstances you're right. Because I think what you're driving at, to use a good European word, it would reveal much more faithfully and accurately the mentality of the originating station or country. Whereas shortwave programs specifically made for shortwave tend to be doctored up somewhat. The VOA, I think, is hardly representative of the top 40 station down the street. On the other hand, the argument in favor of shortwave, custom-made shortwave broadcasting is because of the vast differences in the audiences that you're dealing with. I don't think you would consider yourselves typical of the North American radio listener. You're searching for something different. And what you're looking for is maybe, if you like, a more articulate, maybe perhaps a more serious approach to broadcasting than you're accustomed to. Of course, here, let's not forget we're talking about languages. I can't put the German-Swiss national program on shortwave and you'll be entertained all night. The German-speaking people will, but again, it's a mixed thing. I don't think you can generalize and say it's all good or it's all bad. I think you're very right. Swiss Radio International does relay domestic programs in the national languages, selected ones, especially entertainment. But we feel that in all language services, even the national language services, the needs of our listeners in Africa, in developing countries, and developed countries are different from those than you'll find in the domestic audience. Their concerns, their issues are different. Their priorities are different. And so that's why it takes, in many cases, especially in information radio, a custom-made program to fill the specific needs of those areas. Even in the English service at SRI, I don't know how many of you have ever tried, not only SRI but other stations, to listen to a whole day, one transmission after another, and see what subtle and sometimes great changes are made in a program. If we're going to Africa, we'll put in an interview that the Africans are interested in. The News has an African optic. If we're broadcasting to the Middle East, everything is in the Middle East optic as much as possible. So this is the important thing. We assume that the target audience wishes to hear, among other things, not only about the Swiss culture, but also what the Swiss, for example, are thinking and saying about them. And you will not necessarily get that in a national radio program.
You wouldn't get it under any circumstances, I don't think, because it's for a domestic audience, and the domestic audience doesn't care what the relationship between Canada and Africa or perhaps Europe. They're more interested in what's going on in their own country, which is the aim of the domestic service.
We have here in the United States an organization called NAB, which is a bunch of broadcasting organizations get together, and there's a certain amount of policy formation and so forth, in addition to the merrymaking and so forth. Is there an international organization of any kind of international broadcasters? And if so, has there been any recognition at all of what I call the menace of the airways, which has existed for quite a while, and which many people in North America know about? And we laughingly call it the Russian woodpecker. And if this does exist and it is recognized, has there been any effort on the part of any of you individually or in Congress to state your feelings to the aforementioned country about this?
What good would it do?
Well, let's just ask if, if you don't recognize and state your feeling, I think that you might as well forget the whole thing. Maybe it wouldn't do any good. But you won't know that, I don't think, unless something is tried, in my opinion. And I know nothing about international politics, but I'm just innocently asking the question, and I'd like whatever your feelings are on that subject.
When you mention the National Association of Broadcasters and you talk about Europe, are you looking for an international broadcasting coordinating agency? Or
Right. I'm asking if such a thing exists. I'm very ignorant of this. So
The EBU exists in Europe, but there's not really any equivalent on an international basis that I know of.
the European Broadcasting Union being the umbrella organization of national broadcasting services, program exchange, clearinghouses, satellite feeds between the United States and Europe and so on.
yeah, they set standards as well, don't they? Technical standards?
No. That's, again, the un-United States of Europe. That's up to every sovereign state to decide, and every administration, PTT, and...
Well, they recommend standards. Do they not?
No.
Well, that's interesting because I recall hearing I work in the motion picture industry, and I recall some equipment being manufactured in Europe which was supposedly designed, electronic synchronization. I don't want to go into the detail, but they referred to it as using the EBU standard, which is used in Europe, quote unquote. No, that's not true, is what you're saying.
For film?
Yeah. Time code pulses recorded on film.
Yeah. They have a technical, as I understand it, their headquarters are in Geneva. As I understand it, they have a technical function which is more or less to put their stamp of approval on accomplished facts. They don't develop standards. They simply say, well, listen, fellas, let's get together and agree that it'll be 16 millimeter and it'll be this or that. But these are things that have already been adopted by the stations concerned, and they all agree among themselves without the EBU. It's just a formality.
Fine. Well, my main question was the question of the woodpecker, and have any of you addressed that formally or informally in the past?
Well, you can equate the woodpecker with something that's been happening on the shortwave bands for an awful lot longer time than the woodpecker, and that's jamming. Jamming doesn't exist. Have you ever heard the Soviet Union admit that they jam? If they don't admit it, you can't accuse them of doing it, can they? I mean, every international agency in the world, I think, to do with broadcasting has tried to get rid of jamming, but how long has jamming been going on? And nothing has ever been able to be done.
There was an improvement in terms of the machine gun or the woodpecker. If you're on this side of the Atlantic, you call it the woodpecker. If you're on the other side, it's the Russian machine gun. Everybody knows where it comes from. It comes from Kiev.
The Kiev buzzsaw, too.
And it's 20 megawatts or something over horizon radar. And when it first came out about, 2.5, 3 years ago, no one really knew what it was. There was all kinds of speculation. We speculated on the merry-go-round about it. Atmospheric soundings over horizon. We didn't know, but the CIA came out with a report and said it was over horizon radar. Now they've caught up. The United States has one too in Massachusetts.
Has anybody here complained about that one yet?
Glenn Hauser's written about that. Yeah. But there has been an improvement. The international pressure was so severe and concerted that they had to clean it up. They never admitted that it was coming from the Soviet Union. They were lobbying the Soviet delegation at the ITU in Geneva at all levels of the UN organization, sending telegrams, administrations, PTTs, the FCC, everybody's flooding Moscow with telegrams. So what they did was to reduce the bandwidth from, I think, taking a rough guess, about 50 or 60 KCs, which in some cases is the better portion of some broadcast bands, to a narrow band signal. It's now roughly about 10 KCs, about the width of a broadcast station, and they seem to be making an effort, whether it's divine providence or
they just dropped their power from 40 to 20 megawatts.
Yeah. So they seem to be trying to avoid the stations, getting on top of stations. They seem to have developed a system, which I have no doubt is very sophisticated. Just think for a minute how sophisticated their jamming operation has to be, with monitors all over the world, with Morse signals identifying every single jammer. If Radio Liberty shifts 7 KCs, they're right there within 10 seconds. The network that takes. So apparently they've got a similar situation here with the machine gun or the woodpecker. They're staying around band edges, going into unused portions of the utility bands, but occasionally getting mixed up with the broadcasters. We wish they weren't there, but thank God they're 5 or 10 kcs wide and not 50 or 60 the way they were before. That's a positive development if you want to look at it that way. But the thing still exists. The American system is a hum, as I understand it. I think I've heard it myself, and they seem to be steering clear of the broadcast bands. I haven't heard them mixing in. They've been working on the very high frequencies now. Well, I say very relatively high frequencies, around 11 meters up in there where there's plenty of space, from what I've heard myself. And they're being more moderate. I think the American transmitter is only 5 megawatts. Think of how many homes you could power with that.
You gentlemen, I'd like, Ian and nice gentleman from Switzerland, I've been in the Soviet Union many times, and I speak the language. And on the QT, they're the first ones to tell you that they do jam our radios. They will admit it. They won't admit it publicly, but they admit it, and they have very powerful equipment. But they will admit that they do it on a personal basis. I don't mean to correct you, Ian, but they do. They will
admit it privately.
They do admit it, yes.
Yeah.
And my compliments to RCI. Sometimes I do, Ian, I might say when I'm listening out here after spending those beautiful years in Montreal, I listen for Canadian news. And I'll turn on, the first item is about President Carter or something that we hear on our stations down here. And it's good of you to cover it, but we already get that here. And it might be good to get a little bit more news from Montreal or Quebec or Winnipeg. I was going to write to you about it and didn't get time because I'm pretty busy. Maybe just a little bit more Canadian news. I think we'd like to hear it here. You covered the election, you covered the referendum in Quebec beautifully. That was very fine. I compliment you on that. And you don't mind me saying this, do you?
No,
Maybe
not
just,
at all.
Maybe just a little bit more local news from Canada would be great, because we have, for instance, in California, I have a lot of, we call them snowbirds, and we have a lot of Canadians come down here, and they're just looking for the news from Canada. So I might say that in the wintertime especially, when we get lots of them down here from the provinces, they're just looking for Canadian news.
Yeah.
I was going to write to you about that. Another thing now about, I think Larry Brookwell mentioned about syndicating getting a syndicated column to promote the interest in shortwave. Well, if we could somehow, in our clubs or through ANARC or some way, could contact some syndicated writer who writes in all the papers, just a little bit each day about shortwave, and also on TV, we got somebody like Walter Cronkite or somebody up there in Canada.
I think you'd have a
just
very
thought.
hard job doing that, because they're not going to do something that would drag viewers away from the
They're always
TV.
promoting peace in the world, and one way in peace is to have good shortwave, because there we get all the countries. And I'll just close with saying that I'm very new at shortwave and I enjoy it, and I think a good idea if we get into the universities and colleges through the professors. For instance, up at McGill, and where I used to teach, and some of our American colleges, interest the professors the capabilities of shortwave, of educating the students in world history and the politics. It's better than the books. You get it live.
One thing I'd like to say, we've been discussing this fact about publicity, but I'll give you another example of, say, a hobby or a sport that's relatively unknown. I skydive, which is rather unknown. Like, there's maybe 4,000 members of the Federation, and we suffer from the same problem. But it's a matter of, both the individual as the listener, speaking to people he knows, and the clubs, not just, the broadcasters themselves. It's something you've got to work at. But one thing I object, I forget who mentioned this comment about the fact that North America is so well served by AM and FM stations. But right now I'm working up in northwestern Ontario in a mining town, and all we have the unfortunate demise of getting is the CBC on the AM service, which, I mean, I listen to a few hours, but for your only station is pretty pathetic. But anyway, like communities like that we have a lot in Canada, not so much in the States, where, people up there, are quite amazed. I tell them, well, you want to listen to the baseball, say, on the American Armed Forces Radio and Television Network, or, what have you, or the news, or... I mean, most people don't know about it. I mean, it's something that I figure more the individual person has to approach people, because But also another point that was brought up here about making shortwave more accessible in the sense of having the receivers maybe changed to make them easier to tune. In a way, I wouldn't want to see that change, because to me, if I can just, dial 600 like on an AM station and sit back, that isn't shortwave, because like BBC, I'm sure a lot of people almost don't consider shortwave in a sense, because you can probably pick them up in North America about 22 hours a day.
Yeah, but don't forget, RCI, Swiss Radio International, Belgian Radio, Radio Sweden, any of us, we're not on this earth to provide you hobbyists with a challenge to pick us up. We're trying to get the best possible signal into the target area so that if a person has a receiver that has a button on it that he can push, and there it is instantly, that's what we'd like.
Yeah, but is that shortwave? Like, maybe I should ask people in the audience.
That's not shortwave hobby, perhaps, but we're not in the business of providing a hobby. It just turned out that way due to the nature of the medium. But ideally, we want to get the best signal into the target area in the cheapest possible way.
Look, you can take this any stage of domestic broadcasting. You can start anywhere you want. At least you've seen pictures of the old-time receivers with 14 knobs on them and the cat's whisker and the earphones. Now, do you think that the modern broadcasting industry, as it's known in this country and in Canada, for example, Australia, could possibly exist with equipment like that? Do you think that FM, look, this is even in most of the lifetimes of people here, the younger people. FM, it used to be you buy a big box with antennas and you had to tune and everything else, and now you carry it around in your pocket. Now, it's fine for those adventurous people who like the challenge, as Ian says, to go into their basement and twiddle and fiddle. But if that is, you don't make an industry out of that, and if you expected the housewife at home or the kid on his bicycle to sit around, can you imagine listening to the transistor to you with a box like this and 14 knobs?
30 pounds of battery?
Carry it with you.
Well, I didn't mean
I don't mean to ridicule. I understand and I appreciate it. That's what got me into shortwave radio. That's what made me a radio ham. I mean, I pick up my telephone and call California by dialing direct 001. I can call my parents in Phoenix, Arizona. 001-602-991-8338. And I got them in 10 seconds. But I'll get down there in the basement and I've called CQ for 45 minutes. Phoenix, hello CQ Phoenix, and they're turning the antennas and everything else. Now, that's a challenge. I think that's fun. My wife thinks I'm crazy. And maybe she's right.
Yeah, I just like to bring up another point I guess most people realize that shortwave listeners in the hobby suffers from is we're always confused with hams, and even some people confuse us with CBers, which I think is a big problem, When I mention I'm a shortwave radio listener, automatically everyone says you're ham and you have a transmitter, and I say no, and then they're totally like, what are you, Like, how does the panel feel about that? Is that a common sort of thing you run into?
Yeah, all the time. You just have to change your spiel. You say, I'm a shortwave listener, I'm not a ham. You have to tell them you're not a ham before they ask you if you are one. And then you get down to explaining what you do.
But that's like the old problem. I've met people and they say, what do you do? And I work for the radio. Where do you live? I live in Switzerland. I said, oh, I've heard of, Sweden is a nice place. And they said, no, it's Switzerland. Switzerland, Bern. Oh,
they write to us and ask us about our watches.
Yeah, well, I have a friend of mine who's been to Stockholm. Now, this is not exaggerated. This happens, and it's the same way. We all know the problem. What do you do in the end? You just forget about it and open a can of beer.
Ford, Toyota, they're all cars. You drive a car.
Not too long ago, we had a question about publicity. I think the gentleman in the red sweater was talking about giving publicity on an individual basis, going to universities and things of that nature. As probably some of you are aware, Dr. Kim Andrew Elliott is now teaching at the University of Amherst in Massachusetts. And he's been doing quite a bit as far as educating the public being college students, I suppose, as to what shortwave is as far as academia is concerned. Now, as far as TV is concerned, in the Boston area, there's a scrambled pay TV type channel 68 WQTV, if any of you people happen to be TV DXers. There's a magazine show that is run twice a month, every Thursday. that has a spot by the ARRL, which is, of course, a ham organization. Now, probably a TV station like NBC, KNBC or WNBC on the East Coast, would find it somewhat amusing and probably relatively of limited use for such a large organization. But I suggest that something on a local level, such as these UHF TV stations, which are by and large not syndicated and are more or less independent, could possibly provide such a forum. Now, it'd probably be a little bit difficult. You have to get in touch with the right people, but if we took a model from what the ARRL has done, it possibly could be adapted for our use. This is something that people who are perhaps in a publicity business, not necessarily connected with shortwave, but for some other allied job or something of that nature, that could possibly work. Now, publicity has to go both ways, however. Publicity works with cooperation. And I would suggest, and perhaps this is somewhat far-fetched, I'm not quite sure, that the cooperation has to be two ways. Not only does it have to be with the TV station, between the TV station and the person that's trying to get this going, but the TV station, the person that's trying to get this going, and an international broadcaster. Now, things like giving out program schedules, showing pictures of transmitters and things of that nature would probably be a good start. But I would strongly suggest that anybody that has some idea of putting something on a local TV station, and preferably something which is relatively got a independent type backing, would contact the ARRL. They seem to be very successful about it, and if they're successful, we can use the old idiom, if they can, why can't we?
You don't have the money.
If I can just put my own suggestion in here, I think our best way of publicity is to talk about shortwave radio to our friends. Someone asks, where were you last night? You say, I was in front of my radio. And they say, why? Because I was listening to Sweden or I was listening to Switzerland. And they say, how? And you tell them how, and you try to get them interested. You use the stickers that we get from the stations. You plaster them all over your house. I did it at school. I put it on my notebook. I dug up 6 shortwave listeners who were not involved in clubs. It works. It really does. You just have to get out there and try to convince people that shortwave radio is interesting.
You mentioned the stickers. Could I make a comment for just a second? Yeah. I have a lot of respect for Patrick Humphreys, and I don't mean to make any comments about, but his bit about the stations not being a supermarket. Stickers, pennants, pins, whatever the stations give out are excellent publicity sources for shortwave listeners to carry around, and people ask them, like my Swiss radio watch. People ask me about that all the time, and you can tell them about shortwave radio. They're excellent PR devices, and they're really they don't have to cost much for things like that.
Rather than push TV programs like you're talking about, it might be simpler to try and concentrate on radio, which is a much simpler medium. And I don't know how many of you do read Review of International Broadcasting, but a couple of months ago, Jan Turner described Sweden's community radio system. I don't remember if he said or not in that article, but the Swedish DX Federation has a 45-minute-a-week program in Stockholm about DXing. And in this country, well, in North America too, but I know in the United States, there are an awful lot of college stations and other non-commercial stations, and if most of them are like the ones that I used to work at in this country, they're pretty starving for programs. And if a club came in and said, hey, we could give you half an hour a week about our hobby, you got a pretty good chance of getting on the air, and it's not that hard to make a radio program.
There is such a program, and the person sitting in front of me does it. A lot of people, Glenn Hauser keeps pushing his World of Radio program. We have it on our local radio station in New York, and I know it's listened to. And if you can talk to somebody at a local radio station, tell them. He puts out a program called World of Radio, and it fills a half-hour space, and it's not that expensive. I believe he gives it free, just for the cartridges.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm hoping to offer it via the NPR satellite interconnected network within a few months. Of course, it would only be available to NPR-affiliated stations, and there would be a small charge just to recover the distribution costs. So if you have an NPR station in your area, you might start urging them to pick up this program when it becomes available. If it does, I hope it will.
I could add here that the suggestion from George Wood is excellent, that of approaching college stations, educational stations, because not only are they hungry for programming, but we have mutual interests, in a way, in going to those stations. They need the programming. They're very happy to hear you. But also from the broadcaster's point of view, the listeners to those stations tend to be the kind of listener we're looking for. He doesn't want the top 40, and he doesn't want the screaming maniac. He simply wants the news, he wants information, he wants, if you like, it's a bad expression, intellectual programming that will provoke thought and requires some thought to listen to. Those are good shortwave listeners, and those are prime candidates for shortwave. I think it's only one logical step from one to the other. I'm sure that many people who listen to college stations or to educational stations, public radio, would be glad to listen to shortwave if they knew about it. Many people don't.
I think also there's a great advantage in local organizations, local clubs trying to approach local college stations, not to detract from Glenn's syndicated program, but at least the university programs and stations I've worked for, they like people from the local community to come in. And if you say, hey, we've got a club in town and we do this and we want to make a program here, they'd prefer that over, hey, we can get you a syndicated program over the satellite. I mean, it depends on the station, whether it's an NPR outfit that's glued into the satellite or if it's a little college station. But, you know, there's a lot of room for local clubs to do a lot of work, to push the hobby, and have fun making radio programs.
I've got a comment to make. I've been a shortwave listener for many, many years, and one of the reasons I listen to shortwave, I'd like to know a little bit about the country that I'm tuning in. I'd like to know a little bit about the people. But my main interest as a musicologist, I'd like to know some of the music that is played in individual countries. I'm interested in music. And it doesn't do me any good to tune in Radio Australia and hear top 40 tunes of America. I can get that here. Radio Netherlands plays America, in their English programs, they play top 40 tunes. And some of the hard rock music they play doesn't sound any better than from our local stations. Now, let me ask all of the panel, why do you people feel, or your stations feel, that when you program beam a program to America, that you must play American music? I'd like to hear music of Holland. I'd like to hear music of Switzerland, and so on and so forth. Why do you feel you have to play the top 40 tunes? When we get them here.
No, that's
I don't have to tune into Radio Australia to hear top 40 tunes. I can get them right here in L.A.
That's one argument against carrying domestic relays, because domestic programming often tends to do that kind of thing, whereas shortwave originated programs don't do that. Like our national network plays lots of American music, or you listen to Radio Kuwait, which does a domestic relay of their English service. It's all American rock.
Yeah.
Whereas if you originate a program for shortwave, like what we do usually, it tends to not be as much that. I mean, we don't do that, and I don't think anybody here does that.
We certainly don't do that. I mean, talking for the Belgian radio and television now, we discovered through the correspondence we're receiving from listeners that this is exactly what listeners wanted to hear. They were stressing exactly what you've just stressed, and we have, it's been our policy now for the last, ever since we had our little splitzing, we call it, with the French language community, the French language community in Belgium. Now I'm telling you something about Belgium, which our editor, Leonard Coquet, told you this afternoon, of course, and this is something we make a point of doing too, realizing that in shortwave you don't have possibly a committed audience. The same audience sits down regularly like clockwork, you know, at 5 o'clock. When do we broadcast our bloody program? Midnight, 50, somewhere around there, yes. 12:15, right. The same audience sits down every night and listens to that program. You have, I'm sure, when I work on this basis, that there's always, and so do you, the rest of my colleagues here on the panel, there are new listeners every night. But the fact is, this is just the point that many people have made, and we changed our policy. We were playing rock music and other popular music on the program until we realized that the listeners just didn't want to hear it, and they don't. I agree with you 100%. And we have now, for the last 2 years, been playing nothing but exclusively, even to the
point in the last couple of weeks I've been trying to introduce our audience to Belgian classical music. Now, classical music doesn't come over. I've been very encouraged by the remarks and the comments I've had from listeners. It doesn't come over on shortwave as a rule. But even what has got through finally has been appreciated by the listening audience. They've learned something new, but who knows that Belgium had any classical music anyhow? I'm telling you now, it does.
Well,
we have in the last century produced. So sorry. Okay. So it's an important. It's our policy now to play nothing but exclusively Belgian music in the program.
Earlier we talked about, in our program tonight, we talked about getting more people involved in listening to the shortwave. Now, last winter I had 4 out-of-town guests stay with me for a week. And I tried to get them interested. I said, come on into the shack and we'll listen to the shortwave. On 5 consecutive nights or 6 consecutive nights, we tuned in the major 5 stations. And what did we get? Top 40 tunes. And they said, I don't have to buy a shortwave receiver to get that. I can tune in our local stations back in Indiana and get top 40.
The major 5 stations, you said, sir, you don't have our frequency?
No, one of them was not Belgium.
Yeah, no. It's been our policy. I'm surprised that you haven't noticed this, but you obviously haven't heard the program, but we play nothing but Belgian music. Occasionally we might have, because I happen to like Bette Midler, so I play a Bette Midler number.
Well, anyway.
Just seeing the film, I think it's great. No, talk about that too in the program sometimes, yeah. No, I agree with you 100%, but we have, and we're not defending ourselves, but we have in the last two years done nothing but play Belgian music.
That's beautiful. But as I say, a lot of people, there might be a lot of people like myself, want to know more about your country, want to know more about your customs, want to know about your people, and also want to know more about your music. And that's one reason I tune in shortwave, is to know more about Belgium, know more about New Zealand and Canada, and so on and so forth. That's my major interest, and there's a lot of people I feel the same way.
But if you tuned in every night to BRT, you would know everything about Belgium. I assure you.
Well, in 1 week, Leonard.
This is a very...
Over a period.
I should
it takes a little longer than that.
Because I should be very self-righteous about this and be very smug, because, as you know, I'm sure we only play Swiss music on the air.
How about some more Swiss yodeling?
Oh, you get all you want. But I have to tell you this. We who are concerned with the information program personally I think that's the unanimous feeling, we take a dim view of playing Swiss country music in the middle of commentaries on the Far East and the latest failure of the American nuclear alert system. We find it rather inappropriate. And we tried cutting it down one time, and the listeners keep writing in. They said, what happened to the Swiss music? We want to hear Swiss music. We think it's great. All right, so we play Swiss music. We go downstairs and we talk to the technicians, because it's a fairly small, familial kind of atmosphere. What do you play all this Swiss music for? They don't want to hear that. They want to hear pop music. That's what we tell them. And we tell them that the audience wants to hear Swiss music. So, I think you'll agree with me that there's an ample diet of Swiss country music on SRI, and we intend to keep it that way. Whether it be talkback or even during the Dateline program, our musical bridges between transmissions are all Swiss music.
Well, as I said at the earlier, we are relaying our domestic program, and the New Zealanders don't relish hours and hours of Maori music. We enjoy your American Top 40. If we were to go to more extended hours of direct shortwave broadcasting as we had prior to 1976, of course we would be pitching exactly in that line to provide Pacific music as we did prior to the sort of dissolution of the shortwave service and then its rebirth. But at the moment we're relaying the domestic service, and so we are giving you a diet of what the New Zealander over 40 wants.
This is also a very relative thing, because I agree with you completely, and that's what our programming philosophy is. We just do Scandinavian music. You may listen to us on Saturdays and think it's top 40, but it's Swedish top 40. It's not American. We don't even play ABBA because we don't even consider ABBA to be Swedish anymore. But when I was in India in January, I met with a group of Indian DXers. I was told specifically, why don't you play more Western music? We love Western music. If we hear Western music on shortwave, we will listen to that station. And, I spent half an hour explaining why we didn't do that. But there are listeners in some parts of the world that really like Western music and want to hear it. We're not going to program for them, but there is a different point of view.
I have a gentleman up here who's been waiting for me for about an hour, so I think I'd best get to him.
I'd like to thank Radio New Zealand. We had occasion this last week to have a tsunami alert. And, well, I'd like to go a little further. I've been in shortwave listening for about 35 years. Our local stations here, I think Channel 7 carried about 5 seconds of it. Their weatherman came on and said there's a tsunami alert for the Pacific. Well, I have a farm in Hawaii, and at high tide it gets a little close. And I quick grabbed my radio and started looking for a station in the Pacific to find out just what the circumstances were. And I believe it was Radio New Zealand I got to relayed to me that the tsunami watch had been canceled. And I'd like to thank you for that very much. Another thing, they got the Amateur Radio Relay League. All their publicity is done voluntarily. Most of the people who do their TV spots are volunteer ham radio operators. I can't think of Arthur Godfrey, a few of the other actors.
Barry Goldwater.
And so on, yeah. And I'm sure we've got some people who are celebrities that are shortwave listeners that would be willing to do publicity spots for us. And I think as ANARC, being the North American representative for shortwave listening, could get together and do a voluntary half-hour spot, 30-second commercial or whatever, and put it on some of the public stations or the commercial stations.
Well, I think I, for one, am very grateful to be lumped in with people like Arthur Godfrey and Barry Goldwater. Not that I agree with his politics, but I think the basic problem with personalities such as we have at the table here is we're virtually totally unknown in our own country. We could walk down the street, no problem. Nobody would recognize us. Nobody would hound us for autographs. But you mention your name in an overseas city, and a lot of people know who you are. But you go back home and you're a great big anonymous lump again. So anything we said domestically would carry about as much weight as the hog reports on WKRP.
But I'm not referring to you gentlemen and the lady present here doing spots for your own TV service. I'm talking about from North American television. And we have celebrities here of this country who are shortwave listeners. I'm sure there's one amongst the thousands that we have that would be willing to do a publicity spot for our causes.
Of course, there's one opportunity that you have with cable television. I'm sure it's been done, and that is to get on these closed-circuit television programs. I don't know what they're called. There must be some term for them I'm not familiar with. But everybody jumps in, public access. You just get up and I've got something to say, and you start talking about it. And a lot of these operations are more than happy if you can bring in slides to show your shack and QSLs and give a 30-minute talk and make it interesting, bring a few recordings. Don't ever try to pick up stations on the air in the studio. It never works. And you look like a fool. But that could be done. And this is coming now, public access television. That's a source. A lot of people are home, shut-ins. A lot of handicapped people are sitting and watching these things and wondering what to do with their time. It'd be an excellent opportunity. The only limitation here is imagination and the willingness to do it.
As we all know, there are two major sources of news in the Western world. That is Western news. One's BBC, the other is VOA. The other stations are naturally, well, other than the communist nations, are naturally smaller. It irritates me no end to tune in to a smaller radio station and hear nothing, as far as news is concerned, other than a 5-minute rehash of what I've already heard on the Beeb or the VOA. I wish most of these smaller stations would give up this 5-minute rip and read of world news and would concentrate on their own news. There is no radio station right now which is doing a news by continent format, which was an excellent format of a station that no longer exists, unfortunately. And as of right now, as I say, no such format exists. We're getting world news, albeit SRI and BRT, and of course RCI also that give us news about their home areas. But a lot of the third world nations, the ones that are coming up with super-powered transmitters now, are giving us nothing except world news. And I wish they would talk about what's happening in their own neck of the woods. And the question I pose to you is, how can we convince them? How can we write letters to convince these people, don't give us rip and read news, let us hear about your part of the world?
As far as our station is concerned, what you got to do is just write letters to our management and say so. Because in our English section, for 2 years, we ran only Scandinavian news, whereas all the other language sections were doing this weird mixture of foreign and Swedish. And we were forced by our management to throw in to make half of our news international. We were forced, kicking and dragging our feet and the whole bit. We refused to do it, and they made us. And the only way to get our management to go back on that is to write lots of nasty letters saying, stop doing that stupid news that we can hear in the VOA and tell us more about your country. Letters are the only thing that do anything in our world.
Yeah, but not 5 letters. 500.
Lots.
Because for every letter that's written, there are probably 500 people that felt like writing, but they never really managed to get their pen refilled with more ink, or their pencil sharpened, or couldn't afford a stamp or the paper or whatever. So if a station gets 500 letters complaining about the same thing, they're going to pay attention to it. But don't expect a landslide reaction from 5 letters inside a month. I mean, the shortwave hobby has not been noted for its great reaction to anything. And that's the truth.
I think on the issue of the news itself, something has to be said. Several things have to be said. First of all, you use the expression rip and read, which makes me very nervous. That's what you get on the 250-watt local station, and that scares me to death. That is rip and read, and the guy can't read the name places on his sheet. That scares me. The more stations who are involved in the serious collecting and dissemination of news, the better. Because I don't want to get too close to the bone. But the quality of world news in this very country leaves a great deal to be desired, and I'm talking about the bulk of the population. Now, okay, but there's a couple of aspects to this. And I'll say it very briefly. We have 9 wire services at SRI, which is no great shakes compared to VOA or BBC, but it depends what you do with them. We have a rule that no story can be broadcast unless it's verified by at least 2 agencies. At least. Now, the quality aspect is very important. Also, we go to different areas of the world all the time. And you mentioned the VOA and the BBC. I'm sorry, they are not objective sources of news. Neither of them. They're just not. Both of them have access to grind. The VOA is run by the State Department and is literally the political voice of America. Despite the modicum of journalistic credentials that the station has to offer itself as a source of sort of objective news, it's not objective, neither is the BBC. They are both in their own way propaganda operations. They color the news as they wish to see it. And they make that clear. The BBC has the better reputation for objectivity, but they're still not objective. If you listen to the BBC World Service over a period of weeks and months, they've invented everything from the wheel to the television set, according to them. That's another story. Now, there is a place for the smaller station who professes, or which professes, to disseminate objective news as objective as the mind of man can possibly produce it. Not neutral news, that's something different. But I'm talking about objective news based on the highest standards of journalism. And there's one final point. Like it or not, some people would like to hear all Swiss country music, 30 minutes. The management of Swiss Radio International has decided that the mainstay of our operation is information and the Swiss view of world and Swiss affairs. Okay. The news, which is the most, interestingly enough, from the information, the polls that have been done, the news is always the most important element of any program. And in the developing countries, in other words, the less developed the country you're broadcasting to, the more interesting they find the news. And the plurality of news sources is extremely important. It's the old story of competition, if you like, in a basic sense. People would be very nervous if there was only one source of news in every metro market, or only one newspaper. I think that everybody has a right to disseminate the news and to show their version of it, provided it's good journalism. But in our operation, we background the news. We talk to Swiss journalists. We phone them up, whether it be the Middle East or we have reports from Washington on the political campaign here, or it could be some obscure thing, or it could be a headline story in the news. It's quite logical that before you can attack in depth a world news item like that, you've got to background the news. I mean, what do? You get Barbara Reeser coming on there with the Swiss chronometer, give you the exact time, and you dive in, and now we're going to examine the latest news from the Middle East, and you talk to Arnold Hottinger. I mean, nobody knows what you're talking about. So I think that there's an ample justification, or an ample number of justifications there for stations to broadcast world news without, and I agree with you, ignoring their own news. That's, of course, the proviso.
All right, I have a question over here.
You international broadcasters are certainly interested in promoting an understanding of your culture, your point of view, your language, I think. And you frequently address target areas that use a different language than yours, sometimes areas that use a lot of different languages. My question is, I guess another comment is that in the target area, the people who are most likely to listen to you already have an interest and possibly understand your language to a degree as a foreign language. My question is, why, as far as I know, is there only one country that broadcasts a special simplified form of its language for foreigners who are interested but not entirely fluent? I'm talking about a slow delivery, a controlled vocabulary, but to give the target area the opportunity to learn the language better and to take better part in the culture of the country because the broadcast is in the native language. I believe there's only one country that does that. Am I right about that? And on top of that, why isn't that more commonly done?
Well, I can give you one good reason, that's lack of time. I think you're referring to the Voice of America.
Yeah, the special English.
How many hours a day do they broadcast? How many hundred transmitters do they have? They've got the time and the money and the transmitting equipment to have alternate broadcasts. Somebody like RCI, who broadcasts to Africa in English an hour and a half a day, trying to hit 3 time zones, there just isn't any time for a specialized program like that, because it would bore the person who understands English well enough at the regular speed. It would bore him to death if he had to sit through that in order to get his news from Canada. The BBC has alternative programs for Africa, in addition and parallel with the regular ones, because they've got the equipment and the time. If we had the time and the equipment, we would probably do it too, but you can't do everything in an hour and a half.
I personally disagree with the VOA on their philosophy. This is something of long standing, and I've never been able to find anybody to really justify it in scientific terms. I've been to Africa, for example, on a number of occasions, and I've put the specific question. Do you listen to the VOA? Yes. Do you listen to the special English? Yes. Is it clear? No. What do you listen to? BBC. Do you understand it? Yes. What it amounts to is that it's not so much a question of speed. That's part of it, but it's mainly a question of elocution, articulation, and the vocabulary, the diction. Now, all of us, whether or not there's a pink or a blue or a yellow directive from above that says you shall do this, it doesn't matter. At least my colleagues and myself, and I think everyone involved in any serious shortwave station, is well aware of the problem of communication. I mean, the old communication law that anything that stands between transmitter and receiver is interference, and sender and receiver must be using the same symbols or system to communicate. We're perfectly well aware of that, and the golden rule is, if there's a simple word, use it. If there's any way to simplify the text, to simplify the delivery of the speech, use it. So a moderate speech can be pleasing not only to native speakers of a language, to whom it sounds maybe a little slower than they'd be accustomed to, but it's very much appreciated by people whose language, who speak English as a second or sometimes third and fourth language. We did a survey once at SRI, and we determined that something like 50% of our listeners have English as a second or third language, and not as a first. And that they tend to understand British English more than they do American English. But at the same time, that's another phenomenon. Although the British vocabulary and British speech pattern and common usage is more readily understood by these people, they prefer the basic North American or mid-Atlantic pronunciation. And we know all of these factors. RCI, I think the Canadians are very good because they have the kind of language that people in the third world especially find easy to understand. The VOA has learned that too. If you listen to VOA for any given time, you find out it's not quite down home Americana. It's more almost Canadian than it is sort of northern Midwestern. This has been found to be the most successful speech pattern. This has been found to be the most successful speech pattern for English speakers up till now. There's a technical aspect of this very interesting. British speech has a dynamic content of something like, French is the same, it's about 25 dBs. And American English has less, between 15 and 18. And this is probably one of the reasons why non-native speakers of English find it easier to understand American English than they do British English, as a matter of fact.
All right, we're pretty much winding down. We're pointing for a 10 o'clock close down to our little meeting here. I've saved a personal question for the end. Bob, you don't have a Swiss accent, and George, you don't have a Swedish accent, so my general question is for each of you to tell the audience a little bit how you wound up where you are today. How you wound up at the Swiss Broadcasting Corporation, at Radio Canada International, you know, where you've been taken in broadcasting. Your career, in short. You know, where you've worked, how long you worked there, quick resume of what you've done.
Are you serious?
I am quite serious. I'd like to know. I personally would like to know where you've all worked in your careers.
You want to keep this going till 2 o'clock?
If you can do it in brief, I guess we can be here for, this will just stretch us out until 10 at least, minimum. You're, of course, free to pass.
No, it's interesting you talk about my Swiss accent since I was born and raised in New Jersey.
I said you don't. That's why I said you don't have a Swiss accent. I was wondering.
No, I have a mid-Atlantic accent. I've been working in Europe for about 13 years, and I work with English colleagues and I work with international people, and it's sort of like a remark that was made to President Carter when he took office in Washington. He had a group of school kids from Georgia, and they said, "Hey, you're starting to talk funny." And he said, "Everybody talks funny in Washington." It's a sort of UNEs, if you like. No, it's very simple. I always knew that I wanted to go in this basic direction. It was either going to be broadcasting, journalism, broadcasting, or the Foreign Service. And so now I'm doing all three. And I like languages too. So in the work I'm doing now in international broadcasting, and there's no broadcasting like international broadcasting, you feel as though, in a way, sometimes you're wearing the hat of a delegate to the UN. You feel like a diplomat, you feel like a politician, you feel like an investigative journalist, you feel like a writer. It's everything that you were ever taught to do. And you just, for me anyway, you couldn't go back to selling Kool-Aid on the street there and screaming about used cars. It's just not radio. I mean, it's serious broadcasting. It's broadcast journalism. I think it's at its finest. You meet people, you're sent abroad. I've been all over the world. I've met people that it would sound like I was name dropping if I even went down the list. And I studied, but I think it's wrong to overemphasize the academic importance or the academic background to a broadcaster. Because once I studied in New York and in Montreal, and I remember in New York one of the professors we had saying constantly, I can tell you a few things here and there, but the big university is out there. I can't teach you broadcasting, I can't teach you journalism. And he's absolutely right. So I would say it's a dreadful mistake for anybody to think that he can go through the college catalog and say, well, if I take this semester, if I accelerate here, and I can get these credits, and that by that time I ought to be on WCBS New York. Walter Cronkite wouldn't agree with you.
No, I don't think so.
So it's very much, it's a devotion, it's a profession, it's a dedication, it's a way of life, really, international broadcasting, and I wouldn't trade it in for anything.
All right.
You have to have an international background. You have to be interested in languages because you can't survive without languages, foreign languages. You can't survive without a knowledge of other countries, without a sympathy for other countries and other cultures, to be open-minded. And there's where it's important to have a sort of diplomatic background, to be somebody who either could have gone into journalism or the Foreign Service. It's an element of both.
In 1941, I didn't know anything about HCJB. I'd heard that there was a station down in South America somewhere. And one of the men who was in charge, who had started the work there, happened to come through the town where I was, and I met him, found they had a need for engineering help. It was my background in amateur radio. We felt I could fit in there, so I went down there to do engineering and did a little bit of just about everything down through the years. When I first went down, we didn't have too much equipment, and the studios and transmitters are all right together, antennas and everything in an area about one city block right on the north edge of Quito. So we did transmitter work, a little bit of, well, not much programming, but worked on the antennas and power wiring and telephones, everything, whatever came up we had to do. And I never dreamed I'd get into any kind of broadcasting as such until they started the DX program, which is now a little over 19 years old. We'll be having the 20th anniversary of the DX Party Line program next spring.